Greetings, students. Mr. Little here, and today we're going to talk about the origins of the Age of Revolution. That is, the factors and processes that led up to the Age of Revolutions. That's a key part of Chapter 28. So this is going to be Chapter 28, Part 1, the origins of the Age of Revolution. And so by the end of this presentation, you should be able to answer the two following questions. How did the development of intellectual ideas, new intellectual ideas, including the Enlightenment, contribute to the Age of Revolutions? And how did existing global economic and social structures also contribute to the Age of Revolutions? With that said, let's go ahead and talk about the Age of Revolutions. Now, let's put some ground rules down because there's many revolutions that we know about historically. But when we say Age of Revolutions here, we're talking about something called the Atlantic Revolutions. That is, they are a series of revolutions across Europe, the Americas, and in the Atlantic world, it includes Africa. And they happened roughly between 1760 and 1850, and it's usually said to begin with the American Revolution and end with the Revolution of 1848. Now, what are some key features of these revolutions? They feature armed resistance. They appeal to broader political rights. They also include written documents, constitutions, and declarations of independence. Right? They also all resulted in a shift from an absolutist government to a slightly more representative government. They all resulted in the creation of what we call nation states, and they all expanded political rights for people gradually and limited the power of institutions such as the church. There's a big asterisk to be put next to that third one because who got rights, how quick or slowly they came is going to be different for every single revolution. But it's worth noting these are some key features and some key outcomes. So if you're familiar with College Board's AP World History Curriculum Guide, then you know that there's a very simple answer to how the Age of Revolutions begin, and it's called the Enlightenment, right? That is the movement within Europe as well as in the Americas that human reason and the scientific method should be applied to political organization. Ideas such as John Locke's inalienable rights and the concept of a social contract, or Voltaire's idea that the church and state should be separate and people should have the freedom to speak their mind as any way they wish, or Jean-Jacques Rousseau's ideas of the social contract, which includes the notions of popular sovereignty, and that is that the government gets its will and is derived from the people. There's no government without a people. In general, these are just three of the more well-known Enlightenment thinkers. But in short, them and the other Enlightenment thinkers, mostly men, but also women too, argued for popular sovereignty, the idea that the government derives its power from the people, inalienable individual rights. People are born with certain rights. What those rights are is up for debate, but the idea is that people are born with them. Government should protect them. The government should be limited by perhaps a document or a balance of power, as well as the idea of equality before the law, right? All citizens would be equal before the law. I say all citizens and what would constitute a citizen would be a big question going into these revolutions. And this sounds all pretty democratic to us, but this is not really what all the Enlightenment thinkers had in mind. Voltaire in particular was very big on the idea of a constitutional monarchy and not just throwing open the political reins to the masses. So this is, of course, designed to contrast with what we've seen for most of human history, which is divine sanction, military prowess, or some other authoritative source of power for rulers. This is a new approach that comes with, acknowledges human reason and uses scientific organization. And of course, the Enlightenment itself is incredibly complicated. It doesn't just come out of thin air. And Voltaire didn't just wake up one day and say, I'm going to invent the Enlightenment. It actually is the result of many processes that are very complicated and many factors. Now, here's where I sort of push back a little bit on this notion that it's just the Enlightenment that is the cause of the Age of Revolutions, right? One of the things to keep in mind is revolutions are fought by people. They're led by, educated elites, but, the common folk are not always so enthralled with big fancy ideas, right? Most people can't read during this time globally, and even within these colonies, with the exception of a few places, literacy is generally pretty low, right? It's also worth noting, and I'm going to talk about this more in a second, the Enlightenment actually sometimes led to greater government repression than had been before. And even during the age of the Enlightenment, that is the 1600s to the 1700s, people pushed back against it. In particular, English thinkers oftentimes were sort of not opposed to the Enlightenment, but preferred a gradual limiting of royal power. English political history is a long struggle to limit the power of the monarchy. And it's also worth noting that the Enlightenment is not necessarily a brand new thing. You do see examples of popular sovereignty and limited government all throughout history. And so it's worth noting that while the Enlightenment may be important, is it the be-all, end-all cause of the Age of Revolution, or is it one contextual element? This is the thing to keep in mind when looking at this part of history. There are a lot of other factors to keep in mind, such as the fact that, and we talked about this all through Unit 4 and Unit 3, we talked about the growth of global empires, transoceanic empires, and that is that, colonialism and a global economic system had been created. Now, in particular, Enlightenment rulers sometimes like to use Enlightenment ideas, that is scientific organization, to increase their own authority. And probably the best example of this would be the Bourbon reforms in the Spanish colonies after 1715, in which the Spanish crown used this Enlightenment, scientific and rational form of government to tighten their own control of their colonies, right? They did things like they cracked down on smuggling, they increased royal monopolies on very specific goods, right? And while this made the Spanish crown richer, it actually hurt a lot of local industries, and we'll talk about that more in a second. It's also worth noting that during this time, conflict over territory, conflict over colonial territory was a really big part of just everyday colonial life. And this is going to play a major part in 3 out of the 4 revolutions. Right. In particular, for the American Revolution, the French and Indian War is going to be a really big part of this, which is going to help unify the 13 British colonies into sort of a sense of identity, of fighting a common enemy in the form of the French and the Indians. But it's also going to lead to massive financial strain and instability that's going to play a part in 3 out of the 4 major revolutions that we're going to talk about. So it's worth noting that colonial competition also played a part in setting the stage for these revolutions. And additionally, one of my favorite little facts about the Caribbean and the East Coast during this time is that a lot of colonists had to, got some experience resisting political authority through the act of being pirates. European powers had paid sailors to go be pirates for their enemies, to attack their enemy ships. And then eventually when the wars were over, a lot of these pirates just, went into business for themselves, didn't want to have to go back to being a poor sailor. They wanted to get rich. And so there's some practice in resisting authority through the use of these pirates in the Caribbean and in the 13 colonies on the Atlantic coast. There's also just the fact that in addition to transoceanic empires, there is a oceanic global trading network that has now been developed, right? And Europe, Africa, and the Americas are now tied together through an exchange of goods, most notably probably slaves, but also goods such as new foods, new resources and luxury goods in the Americas and Europe, as well as the importation of weapons in Africa, sometimes called the gun slave cycle. But it's worth noting that all of this global trade also set the stage for the Enlightenment and also set the stage for these revolutions. So, for example, within Europe in particular, these merchants, a class of merchants who'd gotten rich off of trading between Africa and the Americas, we'll later call them the bourgeoisie, if you will, sort of a middle class. They are the ones who are going to push back the most against the French aristocrats and the feudal class, because they see them as these sort of layabouts who don't do anything while they're out there working and acquiring wealth, but they're still class-wise, they're still subjected to the whims of the aristocrats. And so wealthy merchants are going to gain an advantage because they can pressure monarchs using their wealth, and they're going to attempt to use that leverage to take privileges away from the aristocratic or the feudal class. We'll talk about that more when we get to the French Revolution. There's also just the fact that the dislocations of the global economy were also going to lay the seeds of revolt. You have labor demands in South America that are going to be a major source of discontent for Native Americans, as we've talked about. The Enclosure movement in the British Isles would cause many people to immigrate to the Americas, although it would also set the stage for a later industrial revolution because of the emphasis on land use rights, as well as the slave trade and the creation of the African diaspora in the America, which literally cannot be ignored when you're talking about the Atlantic Revolution. So we'll talk more about that in just a second. And again, I've talked a little bit about colonialism already, but it's worth noting that Native Americans, indigenous peoples in the Americas, often influenced the course of these revolutions. And it's worth noting 3 out of the 4 major Atlantic revolutions, that is the American, Haitian, and Latin American revolutions, took place in American colonies. So you have to talk about colonialism. You might remember that by the end of Unit 4, the European powers had these grand empires in the Americas, and Native Americans were often not satisfied with this particular situation. In particular, they're being drawn into colonial conflicts, their loss of population, their labor demands, the disruption to their way of life, all as a result of colonialism. This would lead to a number of revolts and rebellions that kind of stand as a backdrop to the major revolutions that we're going to talk about. So, for example, Pontiac's rebellion is really interesting because because while it was an example of Native Americans trying to drive off the British from what's now the Great Lakes, it also resulted in the creation of a group of colonists who called themselves the Paxton Boys, who actually revolted against their local colonial authority because it felt like it was not doing enough to protect them from these Native Americans. So the revolt against this small colonial government, I believe it was in Pennsylvania, was the result of the feeling of insecurity that they were not being protected from the Native Americans. And so kind of a, Enlightenment ideas, right? Freedom, democracy, all that, or do we just want to be protected, right? Kind of raises that interesting question when we talk about motivations. More notably and more interesting is the movement of Tupac Amaru in the Andes. Tupac Amaru was a local noble who claimed descent from the Incan royal line, and although his birth name was not Tupac Amaru, he took the name Tupac Amaru because of the last Incan emperor had been named Tupac Amaru, and so he used this name, and he led a revolt of mestizos and Indians, mestizos being the mixed people within Spanish colonies, those of European and Indian descent, and possibly European, Indian, and African descent, against local corruption. And this revolt was not necessarily about, again, not about Enlightenment ideas. In fact, they claimed to be revolting in the name of the king. What they wanted was, they wanted an end to the strictness of the Burbon reforms. They wanted an end to the Mita system, and they wanted the king to acknowledge their grievances. They didn't want to end the Spanish Empire. They just wanted the Spanish Empire to work for them. Right? And historians debate if Tupac Amaru actually read this book, the Comentarios Reales de los Incas, but it was a history book that came out about 100 years before his movement. And it's essentially a big document that documents the history and the culture of the Incan Empire, written by an Incan mestizo. And so it's believed that, what inspired Tupac Amaru may not have only been the suffering of his people in the Andes in South America, but it might have also been his reading of Incan history, right? Not Enlightenment ideas, but rather Incan history, local traditions, as the cause of this movement. And last but not least, we have to address the slavery question. Now, what you have to understand, and what I've talked about before, but I'll go ahead and reiterate, is that the Atlantic slave trade had created an entire new cultural diaspora in the Americas, the African diaspora. By the 1750s, almost 6 million Africans had been transported to the Americas over the last 200 years. And by 1750, in the American colonies, for example, in the British 13 colonies, 20% of the population, 1 in 5, was either a slave or a former slave. So you cannot talk about these revolutions, most of which took place in the Americas, without addressing the question of slavery. And that will be particularly poignant when we talk about Haiti, right? But it's also worth noting that the African slave labor had, in part, made the Enlightenment possible, right? That merchant class, those people who sit around all day and debate and think, all of that was made possible because of the global empire that was built on slavery. And when it comes to the Enlightenment and exactly what it is the Enlightenment thought about slavery, it's somewhat of a mixed bag. You had some thinkers, like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who basically said slavery was wrong. It's a violation of political freedoms to enslave another individual. Then you had other Enlightenment thinkers who either weren't that interested in it, or might have had their own motivations to not do anything about it, in part because they might have owned slaves or had business interests involving slaves. It is worth noting that at this time, by 1750, the concept of racial superiority would not have been unusual. Give or take, 300 years of racialized slave trade, combine that with some ancient history and some religious justification, and it's not unusual to think that even the smartest and most radical thinkers of the time probably would have assumed some sort of racial hierarchy or some sort of racial superiority. Some of them were outright about it, but even the ones that weren't probably subtly believed in the superiority of perhaps European culture or civilization over that of, say, individuals from Africa. And it's also worth noting that, again, if the Enlightenment is the #1 cause of the Age of Revolutions, I would say that resistance to slavery would definitely take a close second, if not tie up with the first. And I sometimes mean this in a poetic sense. For example, in the American Revolution, there are many documents written by American revolutionaries about how King George has enslaved them, right? Like they're the slaves to King George, while some of them actually own slaves, but that's beside the point. But demonstrations of human agency and resistance against oppression, right? Resistance to slavery is a source of revolutionary fervor, right? And you have societies all throughout the Americas, in Brazil, in in southern North America. You have the Maroons in the Caribbean, who have struggled and fought and maintained their independence in the face of an empire for almost 200 years, right? And this is going to be very poignant for Haiti, but it's also going to be poignant in the American Revolution and the Latin American Wars of Independence, right? The economic and the social system of Atlantic slavery is going to be a question that each of these revolutions is going to have to confront. What is it going to do on the issue of slavery? Are they going to abolish it, or are they going to allow it to continue? And so the question of slavery is going to have to be addressed in each of these revolutions going forward. So you should be able to answer those first two questions from the beginning of the video. I want to thank you for joining me. My name is Mr. Little, and I will see you next time. Hey there. Thanks so much for watching. I hope this video was able to help you. If you appreciate this kind of work, please like and subscribe. And of course, I welcome any kind of feedback or suggestions, so feel free to leave a comment down below. Thanks so much for joining me. I'm Mr. Little, and I'll see you next time.